The year is 1066, and the end of the world has come to the north of England. The air near the River Derwent is thick with a humidity that clings to the skin like a wet shroud. It is late September, unseasonably hot, a day that should be reserved for the harvest, for the quiet preparation of winter stores. But the fields of Yorkshire are not being prepared for wheat. They are being prepared for slaughter. Picture this scene. The sun is high, baking the mud of the riverbanks into a hard crust. On the grassy slopes, men are lounging, chests bare to the sun, laughter drifting lazily over the water. These are not just any men. These are the wolves of the sea, the terror of Christendom, the Vikings of King Harald Hardrada. They are swimming in the cool waters of the Derwent, washing away the gore of their recent victory at Fulford. Their armor thousands of mail coats, each a masterpiece of interlocking iron rings, lies miles away, heaped in the hulls of their longships at Rickle. They feel invincible. They believe England is already theirs. But here is what the sagas don't tell you about the silence of that morning. It wasn't peaceful. It was a predator's silence, the quiet intake of breath before the scream. On the western ridge, the horizon begins to warp. At first, it looks like a trick of the heat, a shimmering mirage rising from the road to York. But then, the shimmer solidifies. It becomes the glint of steel. A low rumble begins to vibrate through the solace of the Vikings' boots, distinct from the flow of the river. It is the sound of 20,000 feet striking the earth in unison. A cloud of dust rises like a sudden storm front, blotting out the blue sky, and from that dust emerges a forest of spears. This is not the surrender delegation the Vikings were expecting. This is the entire gathered might of the House of Godwin. King Harold Godwinson has done the impossible, marching his army 185 miles in 4 days and nights, fueled by desperation and a fury that burns hotter than the sun. For the 1,500 Vikings stranded on the west bank of the river, the realization is not just terrifying, it is paralyzing. They are unarmored. They are holding hunting knives and light axes while staring up at a tidal wave of heavy infantry, housecarls clad in mail, shields locked, descending the slope like an avalanche. The trap has sprung. And in this moment, the Viking age begins its final, bloody descent. To understand the magnitude of this catastrophe, we must rewind the clock and look at the colossal stakes of this confrontation. 1066 was not just a year of battles. It was a year where the destiny of the Western world hung in a delicate, violent balance. The English king, Edward the Confessor, had died childless, leaving a vacuum of power that three great predators sought to fill. In the south, William the Bastard of Normandy was gathering a massive invasion fleet. In England, Harold Godwinson had seized the crown, frantically trying to fortify his coastlines. And in the north, a ghost from the past had arrived. Harald Hardrada, the Hard Ruler, was the most feared warrior of his generation. He was 7 feet of scar tissue and royal ambition, a man who had served in the elite Varangian Guard of Constantinople, fighting Saracens in Sicily and blinding emperors in Byzantium. Hardrada did not come to England for a skirmish. He came to reclaim the North Sea Empire of Canute the Great. He brought with him 300 longships, the largest Viking fleet ever assembled, and 15,000 warriors. He had allied himself with Tostig Godwinson, the exiled brother of the English king. Tostig, driven by a poisonous resentment, had sold his own country to the Northmen for a chance at revenge. They had already crushed the northern earls at the Battle of Fulford just 5 days earlier. They had occupied York. They believed the English king was paralyzed in the south, watching the channel for the Normans. The Vikings felt untouchable. They had split their forces, leaving a third of their army and all their heavy armor at the ships, confident that the only thing meeting them at Stamford Bridge would be hostages and gold. But Harold Godwinson was a man transformed by the crown. When he heard of the Viking landing, he didn't hesitate. He disbanded his southern watch and marched north with a speed that defied the logistical realities of the medieval world. His men marched nearly 50 miles a day, sleeping in ditches, eating whilst walking, shedding stragglers who collapsed from exhaustion. They arrived in Yorkshire not as a tired rabble, but as a honed weapon of surprise. The geography of the battlefield was a nightmare for the Vikings. The River Derwent bisected their forces. On the west bank, a small vanguard of about 1,500 men was exposed. On the east bank, the main body of the army was encamped, but they were unformed and unready. Connecting them was a single, narrow wooden bridge. When the Saxons crested the hill, the shock was total. Hardrada, a veteran of 100 battles, reportedly stared at the approaching cloud of dust and asked Tostig, "What army is this?" Tostig, hoping against hope, suggested it might be his own loyalists coming to join them. But as the banners unfurled, the fighting man of Wessex and the dragon of Wessex, the truth became undeniable. "These are not friends," Hardrada said, his voice cold. "This is a king's army." The tactical situation was catastrophic. The 1,500 Vikings on the west bank were essentially a sacrifice. They had no mail coats to turn the Saxon spears. They had no heavy shields to form a cohesive wall. But they were herdmen, professional soldiers sworn to die for their king. They did not run. As the Saxon horde crashed into them, they stood their ground. The initial engagement was less a battle and more a butchery. The Saxon housecarls, wielding their heavy two-handed axes and long spears, tore through the unarmored Vikings. The sound of the clash was sickening, the wet thud of iron on flesh, the crack of bone, the screams of men realizing too late that courage is poor protection against cold steel. The grass turned slick with blood within minutes, making footing treacherous. The Vikings on the west bank fought with the ferocity of trapped animals, buying time with their lives. But the weight of numbers was irresistible. Step by bloody step, they were pushed back toward the river. The water of the Derwent began to churn with the bodies of the fallen, the current turning a dark, rusty red. It was here, at the bridge itself, that the battle transformed from a military engagement into a legend. The Saxon army, sensing victory, surged toward the narrow wooden crossing. If they crossed the bridge quickly, they could catch Hardrada's main force before it could form a shield wall. The entire invasion could be ended in an hour. But as the first Saxon warriors stepped onto the planks, they were met by a monster. The chronicles do not give us his name. They simply call him a giant, a berserker whose mind had snapped into the sacred, terrifying state of berserker gang. He stood alone on the narrow timber bridge, blocking the path of an entire army. Imagine the sight. This lone warrior, likely wielding a massive Dane axe, a weapon capable of shearing through a horse's neck, stood foaming at the mouth, screaming insults at 10,000 men. To the superstitious peasantry in the Saxon ranks, he must have looked like a demon rising from the underworld. He was not fighting for survival. He was fighting for a glorious death. The Saxons charged. The first man to reach him was cut in half, his shield shattered like kindling. The second was decapitated. The third was thrown from the bridge to drown in the bloody water below. The Dane axe is a weapon of momentum. Once it starts swinging, it becomes a whirlwind of death. The berserker didn't just kill. He dismantled his enemies. This single man held the bridge for what felt like an eternity. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that he killed 40 men. 40 elite warriors, the best of Godwinson's housecarls, stepped up to challenge him and were cut down. The bridge became slippery with gore, the piles of bodies forming a rampart of flesh. The psychological impact was immense. The momentum of the Saxon army ground to a halt. The rear ranks pushed forward, shouting to cross, while the front ranks recoiled in terror from the reaper waiting for them on the timber. He bought Hardrada the most precious commodity in warfare time. While the berserker held the choke point on the east bank, Hardrada was performing a miracle of organization. He was whipping his startled men into the Svinfylking, the boar snout formation. He was waking up the dragon. He sent his fastest runners sprinting back to the ships at Rickel to summon the rest of the army. He ordered his men to lock their shields, to overlap the rims until they formed a solid wall of linden wood and iron bosses. Back at the bridge, the Saxons realized they could not take the giant with steel alone. Honor had no place here. The fate of the kingdom was at stake. A Saxon soldier found a swill tub, half-barrel used for feeding livestock, and floated quietly into the river, drifting under the bridge. Through the gaps in the wooden planks, he saw the Viking's legs. With a thrust of a long spear, he stabbed upward, driving the iron point deep into the berserker's unprotected groin. The giant roared a sound of agony and rage and collapsed. The spell was broken. The Saxon army let out a collective shout and poured across the bridge like a bursting dam. But the delay had been enough. As the Saxons swarmed up the east bank, they did not find a disorganized rabble. They found a shield wall. Hardrada had formed his men into a long, thin line, curving back at the ends to prevent being outflanked. In the center flew the land waster, Hardrada's legendary raven banner. The banner was said to carry a curse, victory to the man who flew it, but death to the man who carried it. The second phase of the battle began. This was the shield work of the sagas. The Saxons, fresh from the slaughter at the bridge, slammed into the Viking line. The sound of thousands of shields colliding was like a thunderclap. The air filled with the scent of sawdust and sweat. Here, the lack of armor became a critical factor for the Vikings. In a shield wall, the mailcoat is your life insurance. It protects you from the spear thrusts that slip between the shields, from the arrows dropping from above. The Vikings had nothing but their tunics. Every mistake was fatal. Every glancing blow drew blood. Yet, they held. They held because they were the elite of the North. They fought with a fluidity and aggression that the heavily armored Saxons struggled to match in the heat. The temperature was soaring, perhaps reaching 80 degrees. The Saxons, in their heavy mail, were baking alive. Dehydration became as big a killer as the axe. Hardrada, seeing his line wavering under the sheer weight of the Saxon numbers, realized that passive defense would lead to defeat. He needed to break the Saxon will. He did not issue orders from the rear. He threw himself into the fray. The sagas say he went berserk, rushing out in front of his banner, wielding his sword with two hands. He fought without a helmet, his long hair flying, cutting down Saxons as if he were harvesting wheat. For a moment, it looked as though the impossible might happen. The sheer violence of the Viking king's counterattack drove the Saxons back. The land waster moved forward. The Saxon lines buckled. Hardrada looked like the avatar of Odin himself, invincible, terrifying, a force of nature. But fate is a cruel archer. In the heat of his charge, with victory tantalizingly close, an arrow fired perhaps at random, or perhaps guided by a steady hand struck Hardrada in the throat. The giant fell. The thunderbolt was silenced. The hard ruler choked out his lifeblood on the foreign grass he had come to conquer. A silence descended over the battlefield, heavier than the clash of arms. The Viking king was dead. By the laws of medieval warfare, this should have been the end. The leader was gone. The cause was lost. Harold Godwinson, showing the chivalry of a Christian king and perhaps pity for his brother Tostig, halted the attack. He rode out and offered the surviving Vikings peace. He offered Tostig his earldom back. He offered them life. "Go home," he effectively said. "Take your ships and leave." But the Vikings did not drop their weapons. They looked at the body of their king, lying in the bloody grass, and something ancient and dark stirred in their blood. They rejected the offer. They shouted back that they would rather die one atop the other than accept a truce from the killers of their king. They chose death. The battle resumed with a new, grim intensity. This was no longer about strategy. It was a funeral rite enacted in blood. Tostig took up the banner, and the Vikings fought on, fueled now only by grief and the desire to take as many Saxons with them as possible. Then, late in the afternoon, a cloud of dust appeared from the south. Hope flared in the Viking ranks. It was the rest of their army, the men from the ships, led by Eystein Ore. They had run 15 miles in full armor under the blazing sun to save their king. They hit the Saxon line with the force of a hammer. This phase of the battle is known in the sagas as Ore's Storm. It was a suicide charge of magnificent proportions. But the Vikings were exhausted before they even swung a sword. The run had depleted them. Men were collapsing from heat stroke, vomiting from exertion, their hearts giving out inside their chests. In a desperate madness, the Vikings began to tear off their armor. They cast aside their mail coats, exposing their chests to the Saxon blades just to be able to breathe, just to be able to lift their arms. They fought naked to the waist, mad as dogs, oblivious to pain. It was absolute chaos. The sun began to set, casting long, grotesque shadows over the heaps of the dead. The river Derwent was choked with bodies, the water running red for miles downstream. The Saxons, despite their heavy losses, simply had more men. The Viking circle shrank. Eystein Ore fell. Tostig fell. The banner was trampled into the mud. As twilight deepened into night, the great Viking army, the force that was supposed to conquer England, had been reduced to a handful of fugitives fleeing into the darkness. They were hunted through the woods, cut down in the marshes. The scale of the death was staggering. Of the 300 ships that had arrived in glory, only 24 were needed to carry the survivors home. Harold Godwinson allowed the young Olaf, Hardrada's son, to leave, but he made him swear an oath never to return. The land waster had lived up to its name, the land was wasted, and the army was destroyed. But here is the bitter irony, the twist that makes Stamford Bridge one of the most tragic victories in history. The Saxons had won. They had saved their country. They had annihilated the greatest warrior of the age. But the victory cost them everything. Godwinson's army was shattered. His best housecarls, the elite corps of his military, lay dead on the banks of the Derwent. His men were exhausted, battered, and depleted. And while they were bandaging their wounds, counting their dead, and celebrating their impossible triumph, the wind changed in the English Channel. 3 days after the battle, on September 28th, William the Conqueror landed at Pevensey Bay. Harold Godwinson received the news while he was still burying the dead at York. He had to turn his battered army around and march all the way back south. He had to fight the Battle of Hastings with the remnants of the force that survived Stamford Bridge. If those 1,500 Vikings hadn't fought so hard, if that lone berserker hadn't held the bridge, if Hardrada hadn't inflicted such terrible casualties, the history of the world would be different. The Vikings lost the battle, but in their fury, they ensured that the Saxons would lose the war. The English shield wall that fell at Hastings was cracked at Stamford Bridge. Decades later, a chronicler named Orderic Vitalis visited the site of the battle. He wrote that he saw great piles of bones still lying in the fields, bleached white by the sun, a grim monument to the day the Northmen came to die. The locals refused to plow the fields for generations, claiming the soil was too rich with blood. Stamford Bridge was not just a battle. It was the closing of a door. It was the final violent breath of the Viking Age, the era of sea kings, of borderless expansion, of heroes who sought immortality through the edge of an axe, ended there in the Yorkshire mud. It teaches us a profound lesson about the nature of power. Hardrada sought a throne and found only 7 feet of English ground. Godwinson sought to save his kingdom, and in doing so, exhausted the very strength he needed to preserve it. History is not a game of chess. It is a chaotic collision of desperate men, where the victory of today often plants the seeds of the defeat of tomorrow. The Viking Age did not end with a whimper. It ended with a roar that shattered the shields of England, leaving the door open for a new world order to march through. If you want to uncover more lost chapters of history, the battles that shaped our world and the warriors who fought them, make sure you subscribe and ring the bell. We are digging up the past one battlefield at a time. See you in the next one.